Welcome to the National Rural Health Executive Webinar Series. My name is Colleen Bay with NRHA Services Corps and have just a couple of housekeeping notes to review before we get started. Everyone will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, and we're going to try to get through this webinar in about 30 to 40 minutes, offering some time at the very end for some questions. If you have a question for the presenter at any time, just go ahead and punch it into your control panel, and I'll make sure that it gets covered at the very end. And then as a reminder, today's event is being recorded, and I'll make sure that you get a link to the recording before the end of the day. Today, our presenter is John Gomez. John has a strong background in NIST critical infrastructure and has been involved in cybersecurity and high technology for more than 3 decades. He has lectured and trained on cybersecurity and advanced technology topics worldwide. Before founding Sensado, John held executive roles at Allscripts, WebMD, and Microsoft. I'd also like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our partner, Sensado, who has been a partner since last spring. Partners not only offer vetted rural solutions and services, but they also play a significant role in supporting NRHA's efforts on Capitol Hill and help make NRHA conferences, which are dedicated to rural healthcare issues and topics, a reality. NRHA is very selective in what service providers we partner with, and given Sensado's fully managed cybersecurity solutions being designed specifically for critical access hospitals, we wanted to make sure that they were aligned with us. We consider Sensado and John to be rural hospital cybersecurity experts. At this time, I'm now going to turn it over to John Gomez for our feature presentation, Cybersecurity Investments for Rural Hospitals that Provide a Positive ROI. John?
Thank you so much, and hello everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your day. Truly hope that this is a valuable addition to your toolkit as you guys think through your investment strategies related to cybersecurity. Although this was touched on briefly, I just want to mention a couple things about Sensado. We started back in 2013. We were the first healthcare specific cybersecurity firm, and today continue to be a healthcare specific cybersecurity firm. Just a couple things to know about us. We are what's known as an ISAL, so we work under Department of Homeland Security as a private organization. We're not affiliated with them other than being an ISAL, but we do share threat intelligence and incident response information with them back and forth. And so the other kind of partnership we have that is very specific to healthcare is we have a memorandum of understanding with the FDA to share threat intelligence as well as support incident response related to medical device security attacks on a national level. So a lot of the things that we talk about in this presentation really have its foundation in the broader work we do, not only with government agencies, but also state hospital associations, organizations like NRHA, and the work we do day to day with hospitals across the US. So this session specifically actually is part of a larger leadership session that we do specifically for those organizations that are looking to evolve their leadership skills when it comes to cybersecurity. This one in particular focuses on, as you already know, investments and how to develop an investment strategy. So there are a variety of different things we're going to cover in this. We're going to try and give you somewhat of a playbook that you can customize for your own organization. One of the things I will say is that we have had a lot of organizations embrace kind of the pattern that we lay out, the playbook that we lay out for you, and have had some good success with it. But you need to right size it for what your resources can or can't do. There are some critical things here to keep in mind, but we'll get into those as we go. So kind of want to set a little bit of tone as to who you're defending against, right? Typically when I speak to like boards of directors and C-suites, I'll ask them to close their eyes and think about who is it that is coming after your organization? Who is it that's hacking you and attacking you? And all too often, what I hear, the description I get from people is somebody like you see on the screen before you now. You know, somebody who may be antisocial, maybe they're high school or college dropout. They spend all their times playing Fortnite or some other game, and they hack and they break into systems. When I press people to kind of think about a more modern hacker, like what's a hacker look like today? What is the current version of this ideology that we have in our mind? People will then kind of describe, well, it's a bunch of kids that wear hoodies and they're in some basement in Czechoslovakia or Prague or somewhere, and there's these leaky pipes and they're pounding away at keyboards and there's punk rock music playing in the background. And these two images, although they are somewhat accurate, and there's a challenge with them. And I think part of that challenge is that it doesn't allow us to really fully understand who the adversary is that your organizations have to defend against. And unfortunately, the size of your organization has nothing to do with professional attackers coming after you. In fact, smaller organizations make a great target of opportunity for hackers because you are a great sandbox. I'll often working with critical and rural hospitals, I'll hear people say, well, why would anybody come after us? You know, we're too small, we're under the radar. But you use all the same systems and technologies that any hospital does. Some of you may be Meditech shops, and maybe you're not using Epic and Cerner, but in terms of the medical devices you employ, the access control systems, and a variety of the other things that you do are no different than any hospital in the United States, which also creates its own challenges due to the limited resources you may have. But from an attacker's perspective, you have to keep in mind two things. One, that if it is one of these two images I just showed you, that type of hacker, what we'd consider a more amateuristic hacker, you know, they're not going to really care how big or small you are. They're still interested in coming after you. For a more professional hacker, then you become a great sandbox. You become a great test bed, right? You have access to the same technologies, but maybe you haven't made the same investments in defending those technologies. And so one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that in today's world, the hackers are much more professional than ever before. They have full-time salaries, they get vacations. Typically you have 30 days vacation from the day you start. You get signing bonuses. You are getting salaries that are comparable to working at Google or Facebook or Microsoft or Apple. So it has become a profession. And we see that there's active recruitment going on from universities in Europe, and parents often encourage their kids to take these positions and these jobs. And you may be wondering, why would a parent ever encourage their child to go work for a criminal organization, right? Because that's ultimately what these are. And the reason is because spending 2 years, 3 years at an organization like this, you'll be exposed to technologies that you would never have a chance to work with at pretty much any other organization. So you become much more valuable. And you're not really missing out on anything because you do have full benefits, and we've seen even bonus plans and incentive programs that have come up as we've examined this space over time. When we think of motivation from these different groups, there are basically three ways that we categorize them. One is cyber criminals, two are cyber spies, and three are cyber terrorists. Now, of the three groups, the ones that have been the least active in this realm, at least in terms of carrying out attacks, is cyber terrorists. These must be a bigger challenge when ISIS was a much bigger threat. But since ISIS has become less of a threat, although they're starting to become more of a threat again, cyber terrorism has kind of died down. If ISIS or Al Qaeda or someone does reorganize to a much larger extent, we suspect that we'll see cyber terrorism continue to evolve. So the two groups that we typically see are cyber criminals and cyber spies, and understanding their motivation is very important. So cyber criminals, obviously the motivation there is financial, right? These are the people carrying out ransomware and doing other types of attacks of that nature. Cyber spies are typically trying to gather intelligence and are mission oriented. Now, some of you may say, well, you know, why would cyber spies come after us? Well, a lot of it has to do with geography. If you're near any type of military population, defense contractors, automobile manufacturers or suppliers, it doesn't even have to be that you're in the middle of Detroit. You could be out somewhere in the suburbs, or way out into a rural area where you have small vendors who are participating in the supply chain, and they become targets of opportunity for intelligence and mission operatives. Now, they may also be supplying your hospital with systems, and so you become a great pivot point for them. So the reason I wanted to take a little bit of time to break this down for you is to help you understand that ultimately, when you're thinking about the investments that you need to make in your organization, it's always important to understand the level of threat. If you clearly understand the level of threat and what you're defending against, it helps to hopefully give you a different perspective on that investment. You know, what I try to get across to, again, boards and C-suites is, you know, 2, 3, 4 years ago, we weren't talking about any of these types of organizations or this level of organization in terms of their capabilities. And today we are, and they're very real. Yet the very resources that you depend on, your IT and IT security teams, are are being asked to defend against nation state or a very highly organized cyber criminal organization. So you have to think about what are the compensatory investments that you've made to help assure your IT and IT security team have the tools and the knowledge to be able to defend against this level of sophistication, because they're not really defending against a hacker in the basement who's kind of hopped up on Jolt Soda and chili and just happens to stumble across your environment. It's a much more organized set of and professional individuals that they're defending against. So the key challenges that we face when we're thinking about this from a purely financial perspective is, trying to figure out, well, how much cybersecurity do I need to invest in? And when we're talking about smaller hospital organizations with already restrictive economic challenges, how much of that budget can go to cybersecurity and how much is enough? And so that's kind of the main question we're trying to answer here today is really, how important, how much do I need to invest? And I will give you a spoiler alert that the answer to that is not very black and white, and how you get there is probably not something that is, I would say, the easiest to do, but is definitely doable. And it doesn't take a tremendous amount of time, but you do have to invest some time to get to that answer. And I'll explain what I mean by that as I take you through the different steps that we talked to. One of the things I like to highlight in these conversations is that we not just have to deal with, obviously, the attackers and are defending ourselves, but we have to understand that financial investments relate directly to the consequences of legal outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's something, this is an article that you see on the screen that was actually done several years ago, 3 years ago, by FDA. It was a blog post. So this isn't any kind of regulation, but I think FDA did a good job in this article in really highlighting that we need to think about cybersecurity in a different way. And one of the things they brought up is, do patients have a right to know about security threats in your hospital? Now, to make this a little bit clearer, think about the fact that any patient that comes into the hospital has informed consent, right? You sign a consent form that you understand there is risk associated with the procedure or the treatment that you're going to get. Now, what's not in that in consent is that the very devices that you're relying on for the care may fall victim to a cyber attack. And when you start thinking about it from that perspective, you start to change your thinking about who really is responsible for cybersecurity in the hospital. If you declare to the hospital, to the patients that, cybersecurity here is an issue for us, suddenly the priorities change. Most hospitals don't want to be disclosing that. Unfortunately, there is a mortality event associated with cyber attacks. So what I mean by that is that there was a study actually done, a Vanderbilt study was done back in 2016. And what they did is they looked at significant cyber attacks. Now, what do we mean by significant? A significant cyber attack is any cyber attack that disrupts hospital operations. So obviously, depending on the size of the hospital and the resources, a small attack could be a very disruptive situation. But what they found is that anytime there's a significant cyber attack, it impacts patient mortality. And the reason for this is not really often apparent. It's not that the attackers went after patients. It's basically the emotional and psychological response of the clinicians. So if you have a cyber attack and word gets out across your hospital that we just had a cyber attack, we've been attacked, the clinicians themselves start to second guess whether or not they can trust the very devices that they're using. They also start to become not focused on patient care. They become focused on, did the attackers get to my personal financial information? What happened? What's been affected? Are we gonna, have to shut down the hospital? Unfortunately, all of those things come together to create a patient safety issue. And what we find is that domino effect ultimately is, unfortunately, the outcome is a negative patient consequence, right? We end up with mortality increases. So it's interesting that we kind of haven't really talked a lot about in the healthcare space that, hey, the level of sophistication by attackers now translates to, should a patient have informed consent? And we now have patient mortality attached to any type of cyber attack. This doesn't have to be ransomware. Again, it could be anything that's significant. We're defining significant by anything that impacts hospital operations, right? So this is a pretty hopefully eye-opening challenge. Now, unfortunately, all of this has ultimately translated to a death. There's a hospital about a year and a half, 2 years ago, actually 3 years ago, that a child died due to a ransomware attack. And there's a lawsuit that was brought against this hospital. I believe it was settled out of court. The challenge with this was that a mother came into the hospital to deliver her child, and she did deliver the child. The child was connected to a fetal monitoring system, and that fetal monitoring system did not detect anomalies in the heart of that child, which then led to the child dying. Now, when we think about the things I just mentioned to you, informed consent, uh, increased mortality due to significant cyber attacks, all of those things kind of lined up in this situation. When the mother came into the hospital, the ransomware attack was actually already occurring, but there was no policy or procedure in that hospital to actually inform the mother that, hey, this is happening and you could have an additional risk for us providing care. There was lack of informed consent. The second thing that kind of occurred here was that the clinical staff probably didn't handle the attack the best way they could, and ultimately they didn't detect that the child had this anomaly, and that led. So there was a lawsuit brought against them. Now, the reason I'm bringing all this up is kind of paving this path that often we think about the fact that security investments in the hospital are the responsibility of the IT team. And as you can start seeing here, we're really going much further beyond what IT probably is charged with as responsibilities. And we need to think about, as leadership of that hospital, are we really truly investing appropriately? And it kind of grows into the fact that we can't just think about we're checking the box anymore, that ultimately you'll be judged by the credibility, the defensibility, and the capabilities of the security program. And all of those three things, credibility, defensibility, and capability, are a direct outcome of investment. And so when we think about how do we structure our investments, we need to be thinking about, are we going to have ultimately a credible, defensible, and capable security program? And we're going to continue to talk about how do we get to that state, but I wanted to lay a foundation and hopefully give you some backstory in terms of why this is important beyond what is typically understood. So there's kind of two theses, and this is the thesis we get up as a company every day and think about how do we do better with our clients and help them do better. The first one is comply, detect, respond. All of us need to be thinking about, are we doing the very best we can to comply with best practices and regulations? Have we the ability to detect threats in a timely manner? And most importantly, can we respond to those threats in a timely and professional manner? The second part of this is, despite our best efforts and whatever level of investments we make, there is a chance we're going to get breached. And if we get breached, have we made the right proactive decisions to reduce legal liability and increase legal defensibility? So I won't go too deep into this, but ultimately, these are the two theses by which any security program we believe should be operating. And if we can do these things appropriately, then we're going to address things like informed consent. We're going to think about how do we deal with our clinicians remaining focused when there is a cyber event that occurs. How do we assure that if something does go wrong and the ultimate negative outcome occurs, that we are actually able to defend our decisions? Now, one of the tools that I will give you before we actually get into the financial tools is this concept of a deposition test. One of the things we do, we sometimes come in and do this as part of a tabletop simulation, is we'll gather the C-suite into a room and we'll go through a mock deposition. Now, you can do this on your own, and just every time you go to make an IT security or IT decision, think about that at some point 18 months down the road, you may be deposed. Your policies may be deposed, your procedures, your employees, your IT staff, everybody's going to probably get deposed, and they're going to have to answer some very hard questions. If you apply this as part of your upfront decision-making process, would you want this decision to be second guessed? Would you want to have to defend this in a deposition? You often find that you'll either change your decision, or you'll determine that, yep, this is the right decision. We would be completely comfortable if a set of attorneys decided to look into this deeper. And it's not just attorneys, which is something I should mention here. One of the things I often tell people is, keep in mind there are expert witnesses, right? I could be your worst nightmare if I'm on the stand against you, because I'm going to be asking or advising the attorneys to ask you some very hard questions when it comes to your security program. So the deposition test is something we kind of played up for a lot of our clients and help them think about how they're going to make their decisions. Ultimately, decisions obviously impact financial investment. So it's a tool that you can use. So as we transition from kind of the background and where we are today and some of the challenges that we have to think about, one of the first things you need to think about when you think about financials is your level of risk tolerance. And this is a board level decision. Sometimes I'll see IT security teams making this decision and explaining to me what their level of risk tolerance is. If we go back to the deposition test and reducing liability, ultimately your CTO, your CIO, your IT security director, your IT manager, your third-party outsourced IT vendor, whoever that is not the right person to be deciding what is the cybersecurity risk tolerance for the hospital. This is typically a boardroom decision. The C-suite may bring that decision forward to the board, but ultimately it's going to be the board. Why? Because the board usually has a risk management committee or a compliance committee or something of that nature. And we've already talked about how cybersecurity can impact patient care. So you can kind of bet, I don't know where this saying comes from, but I like it, dollars to donuts, that if you get brought into a courtroom, you're going to be asked about how your risk tolerance protected or impacted patient care related to a cyber attack. So this has to happen. It's one of the most important things. Now, obviously, the higher risk that you are willing to take, the lower level of protection you have. So that means you're going to have less of an investment. But again, you'll have to defend that. On the opposite side of this is having no risk, which is completely impossible to do. I mean, even the NSA and CIA and other military organizations get hacked. So we need to kind of figure out, but what is the appropriate level? And there is no one size fits all. I cannot tell you, well, on average, what do other hospitals do? And I'll explain why you shouldn't be asking that question in a little bit. But in any case, you need to decide what is right for you. And that balance is going to be realistic investment versus realistic ability to apply that investment. Whether you understand your level of risk tolerance or not, before you get into how much money should we be spending, you have to figure this out. It will be something that gets called out. You will be asked by an attorney in a deposition, what is this organization's level of risk tolerance? What did you believe was the appropriate level of protection for your hospital and why? And you need to be able to articulate that. All of this will drive level of investment, level of impact you have, and the level of sophistication that you need from a cybersecurity perspective. So HR 7891, I'm going to skip that in terms of, well, actually, I'll cover it briefly. This is a legislation action that went into effect on January 5th, 2021. And it basically says, hey, if you have a strong cybersecurity program that meets or exceeds the current best practices, and you have a security event, you can point to the fact that, hey, we did everything possible, and that will reduce or eliminate fines, regulatory fines. So there is some kind of incentive here to have the right things done from a regulatory perspective. This doesn't mean you won't get sued. It just means at least like OCR and HHS will have a less of an impact on you from a liability and a fine perspective. So that's what HR 7898 is. If you're not familiar with it, it is worth kind of at least understanding it a little better, because it can help you maybe justify why you need to make investments in order to hopefully afford you protection in terms of the types of fines that you see down the road if you were to get breached. So we're going to get into that in a minute. So one of the big things, so once you have your risk tolerance, so we're getting into our playbook now, right? And the first part of our playbook, the first step is define your risk tolerance. So once you have your risk tolerance, the next thing you need to figure out is, where are you in terms of your organization's maturity level from a cybersecurity perspective? And this is when we transition back to your IT team and your compliance teams or people that are going to determine what's your level of maturity. You can do this on your own, or you can hire a third party such as us to come in and help you understand your maturity level. The way this works is you kind of want to develop a maturity model, right? And use this maturity model to kind of look at where you are and where you need to go. And based on your risk tolerance, you're going to prioritize what needs to get done first. So there are a variety of maturity models. We use one known as C2M2. It comes from the Department of Energy, and we adopted it for healthcare. It's a pretty simple thing to do. It's not very expensive, but it is a critical component that once you know risk tolerance, you need to figure out in a way that not just IT or compliance, but everybody in the organization, your management team, can understand where you sit in terms of your cybersecurity maturity. Again, we can look at this from a defensibility perspective, and if I subpoenaed your C-suite and asked them, so tell me, how are you guys managing risk? Let's just take your CMO. They were like, wait, you're going to subpoena my chief medical officer if there was a cyber attack? Yeah, if I was me and I was counseling a law firm bringing a class action suit against you, yes, I would definitely subpoena your chief medical officer. And what would I ask them? I would ask them, okay, sir or ma'am, how is your cybersecurity risk management program? What's the maturity of that? How well is it? Chances are they're not going to know in today's world. Hopefully after this program, they will know, but typically they're not going to know. Now, why would I ask that? Because my next question is going to be is, do you believe there's any impact related to cybersecurity risk management and clinical outcomes during a cybersecurity event or an attack? And they're probably not going to know what to say. And then I'm going to reference the Vanderbilt study and explain that, how did you not know this? You're part of the hospital. Isn't clinical care part of your responsibility in assuring you have a safe and effective environment for patient care? So this is how all this starts to tie together. So first step, figure out your risk tolerance. Second step, get a maturity model. If you're going to do a maturity model, make sure you're looking at it across different domains, right? You're going to look at risk management. You're going to look at things like threat and vulnerability management, and situational awareness, and your incident response capability. So again, there are different maturity models out there. You can do them on your own. You can hire a third party, but you need to think about figuring out a way. And the HIPAA assessment, just so you know, HIPAA assessments are critical to do, but they really don't give you a kind of maturity score of where you are and what are all your real gaps. Most of them are kind of, to be honest with you, most HIPAA assessments I see are a lot of fluff and not very usable in terms of, okay, now that we know where we are, here's where we got to get to meet our risk tolerance capabilities. So I'm going to skip over this. The last piece of this is then figuring out, let's say we use this maturity model I just showed you with these 10 different areas. You kind of want to then figure out what's your strategic priority, what technology investments you need to make, what training investments, what security awareness, and is there any investments into policy and procedures, and what's that total of investment for that domain, right? That risk management, asset and change management. So just to step back, this is basically just a spreadsheet, right? First step, we figured out our risk tolerance level. Now we figured out our maturity model. Once we figure out our maturity model, we then need to figure out how we fill in the gaps, right? If I go back to this example here, anything that's red is an area that needs improvement. The darker the red, the more work. And anything that's green is, in this case, this hospital will be doing well. So we need to figure out how much it's going to cost to go deal with all these red items over what period of time, right? Is it going to be 6 months, 18 months, 24 months? And how do we prioritize these? So we're basically trying to take this maturity model, this dashboard, and convert it into a spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet ultimately becomes our financial model, our investment strategy. And we can have debates. This is why everybody needs to understand this. Like, you can't just have this by the IT organization. Everybody needs to know in your organization, that's at a management level and a board level, what is our maturity and how far off are we from what our risk tolerance level is. So kind of to give you a little example, you start with your risk tolerance and you develop, that's going to develop and drive your maturity model. Once you have that, you're going to define your spreadsheet, your financial workbook, if you will. Then that's going to talk about how you can address anything that needs work to be done. And that's ultimately going to justify and be able to defend your risk tolerance position. So these three things together. So if you had to go into court, you'd be basically bringing this with you, right? You'd be saying, here's what our level of risk tolerance is for the current threat landscape. Here's where we did a maturity modeling exercise. We realized we had these gaps. Here's the investment we were going to make to address those gaps. Or we couldn't afford to do this, but we weren't kind of an ostrich. One of the worst defenses you can ever do is ignorance, especially when human life is on the line like a patient. So you want to still be able to say, look, we knew we had these gaps. We couldn't afford to do it, and here's why. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Real quick, I'm going to touch on ransomware just to kind of hit this in terms of, this is a question that comes up a lot when we're presenting this. A lot of times we see people get into this debate, like, if I'm attacked by ransom, is it a reportable event? Is it not? I will tell you the most important thing you can do in relation to this is have this conversation with either your general counsel or your outside counsel and determine what your hospital believes. If you get hit by ransomware, is it a reportable event? I will tell you, if you ask us, we believe the answer is yes. And there's a lot of reasons for that. we believe that ultimately you're much better off in any kind of cyber event to be completely open and transparent. You don't want to have to defend yourself on a stand and go, well, we didn't think it was a reportable event, and then have some smart aleck tear you apart on cross-examination. But again, we're not attorneys, and so you should have this conversation before you have a ransomware attack as to whether or not you believe a ransomware attack would constitute a reportable event under HIPAA and to the OCR. So that kind of brings us to the second stage of the question. Well, so we have a ransomware attack. Should we pay or should we not pay? And how do we deal with this from a financial perspective? First thing to think about is that ransomware payments are rising. They're now 6 figures regardless of the size of your hospital. There are countdown timers becoming commonplace. You get hit by ransomware and you'll see a timer on the screen that tells you every hour that goes by or every 24 hours, we're going to delete a file and we're going to raise the ransom. So they've become very good at putting pressure on you to make a decision. Most organizations do pay, including law enforcement. I am not advising you to pay. I'm advising you to have the conversation as to whether or not you will pay or won't pay before this ever occurs to you. It's very important to have these things decided beforehand. You have to consider recovery costs. There's a very good chance that recovery is going to be pretty extreme. Most ransomware attacks now take people out of the picture for about 6 to 8 weeks. Now, obviously, this has become a big challenge in terms of cyber liability insurance. We just spoke to a hospital the other day, about a 300-bed hospital that went from an $87,000 a year cyber liability insurance premium last year. This year they got their renewal notice, and their annual premium was $557,000. So it went up several hundred% in the course of 12 months. So you need to think about how cyber liability insurance is going to help you, and can you even afford it? But ultimately, having a conversation of should you pay or not pay should happen before the ransomware occurs. And there's some scenarios that you can run through. Well, how long can you go without paying for the ransom? If we have to wait 6 to 8 weeks to recover, can we stay in business for 6 to 8 weeks? What are we going to do with our patients? How are we going to manage? What are we going to do? There is this concept of exploitation now. Exploitation is where the attackers are in your systems on average for 200 days before they ever launch the ransomware attack. In the past, we used to believe that the way it occurred in the past is somebody clicked on something and boom, there was a ransomware attack immediately. In today's world, you do something wrong and the attackers get in, and they're now in your system for 200 days. The reason they're there that long is they customize the attack against your organization, and they also analyze your data. So what happens is you come back and go, well, we're not paying you, blah, 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 whatever it is you're going to say. And they say, okay, Skippy, I've got a little surprise for you. Hang on 1 second. And what they do is they call your patients, and they tell your patients that have been through any kind of rehab, behavioral crisis, STD, anything of that nature, especially if it's a prominent person in your community, like board members typically are. They will then call them and say, if you don't want this information getting out, then you need to explain to this hospital that they will pay the ransom in the next 24 hours. We've seen this exploitation go to the point of calling employees and telling your employees that if you don't pay the ransom in 24 hours, you'll never see your child again. These are very effective tactics. Whether they pull them off or not doesn't matter. You're going to now be dealing with patients and employees who are really freaking out. And when employees freak out, what happens? The Vanderbilt study kicks in, right? Because now we have the psychological component that ultimately kicks in and takes us away from focusing on our patients. So all of this kind of ties back to, okay, how do we reduce this risk? And we need to, what's our risk tolerance level, and how does that impact our investments? So hopefully we don't get into this position. So that's why this is all kind of important. If you're going to make this decision to pay or not pay, one of the big things I would tell you to do is conduct a ransomware simulation. Figure out how many of your systems would actually become vulnerable to ransomware and how long you can go without paying. Again, use 6 to 8 weeks as your time. Most people, when they do downtime procedures, when we do incident tabletop simulations, we find that they can handle outages for 24 to 72 hours. But once you start going beyond 72 hours with no computers, no medical devices, no physical access control systems, people start to break down. So think about if you're really going to be able to sustain. And all right, back to financials. So I can't give you like a process, that process being get your risk tolerance, do a maturity model, figure out where your gaps are, and then figure out how you're going to prioritize investments around those gaps to address them, or determine that you can't afford it and then be able to defend that position. To really understand ROI is very difficult. There's a lot of things I've seen out there, a lot of calculations people try to do, but with cybersecurity, you can't really calculate your annual loss expectancy. So the fact that you can't calculate the annual loss expectancy in a very robust manner is very hard to figure out ROI. So ultimately, it's about, hey, did the investment you make improve your maturity, and did that help you meet your risk tolerance requirements? And if you could point to that, then chances are you have a very strong ROI. If you look back on something over 12 months and you realize, hey, we made all these investments and our maturity still isn't where we want it to be, then obviously your ROI isn't that good. And I'm sorry to kind of make this rather simplistic, but I think simpler is better than trying to come up with a formula for you that you put in all these parameters and you find out you've had a 10% ROI on your security environment. I don't know how anybody can do that and be accurate. But there are some approaches you can take, and it just depends on how you want to do this. One, you could determine if every medical device, including things like your cath lab, CT scanner, MRI, whatever you have that's a medical device which is revenue producing, went offline for 24 hours, how much revenue loss would you have? Then calculate that over 8 weeks, and that'll tell you what your revenue impact would be. So then you can determine, well, if we lost that amount of revenue, is it worth making this amount of investment to hopefully prevent that? The thing that everybody kind of gets weirded out about is there 100%? Is there any 100% that you will not, even if you make all the right investments, still not get breached? The answer to that is no. Anybody that says, yes, if you do this, you're never going to see a breach, I would challenge what they're saying. But that doesn't mean that you should just take the position of, well, if we're going to get breached, we're going to get breached, because the consequences could be much higher, right? We've already started hearing about situations where some attorney generals have thought about bringing criminal charges against hospital leadership if a patient's safety is impacted, either as assault or attempted murder or manslaughter. So you need to think about broader than, well, if we're going to get hit anyway, should we make these investments or not? So one way is to do this ROI medical device calculation and see what your revenue impact is. Okay, one question I often get is people go through this and they still ask me, well, what percentage of my IT security budget should be allocated towards IT security? I will tell you that's a very 1980s approach to this, and it's not going to stand up if you go to court. You don't want to be in a position where you say to somebody, the industry average for us is 5.6% is what we should use for IT security. It's not a good thing to do. I'll explain why, but I want to give you a little bit more kind of insight into this. One way that we see this sometimes manifest itself is people will say, well, let's look at other hospitals our size and figure out what they're spending, and then we're going to spend kind of sort of what they're spending. I'll get that question a lot from leadership, where they'll say, well, how many people does XYZ hospital have? Or can you compare our maturity model to other hospitals that are about our size? And I always advise you not to do that, and for some reason people do it anyway. The reason you don't want to really do that is because a comparison of that nature, if you ever have to go to court, is not a really good place for you to be. Because if I was the person advising the opposing counsel, I would ask them, how did you compare your hospital to the other hospital? Did you have a list of every system, the age of those systems, the operating systems, the software and versions that were deployed? Like, how did you compare, right? How did you really know what their challenges were and how well they do in terms of risk management? Even if they had the exact same maturity model, are they running all of the exact same software as you? Because then you really don't have a comparison. If you don't, they could have greater risk or less, or you could have greater risk or less. What's the team level of skill? When you did this comparison between you and another hospital to justify expense, did you interview their IT and IT security team? Did you understand if they're better or have better skills than your team? So how did you know that just because there's similar size bed counts, that you guys should spend the same amount of money. We're going to start asking, did you speak to them about their level of risk tolerance? Maybe they had a lower risk tolerance than you. Maybe they decided, you know what, we're going to roll the dice. So we're not going to make as big an investment as we think we should have to. Ultimately, did you just compare bed size? And that's what we normally see, right? When somebody says to me, hey, can you compare my maturity or my security program or my IT investment versus other hospitals in our category, just because you're a critical access, just because you're rural or community or whatever you may be, doesn't mean that you actually have the same systems and the same talent levels. And so any comparison based on bed size will not stand up as far as being defensible. It's a kind of an easy way out, but it's not defensible. And you have to think about how do you improve your defensibility. Defensibility, kind of a few ways that you can think about how do we put ourselves in a position where if we can't afford something, we truly can't, what are the ways we can defend ourselves? Well, one is patient safety and care, right? If we would have made this investment, something else in the environment would suffer, and that would have led to a patient safety issue. I couldn't afford security monitoring because we couldn't then do XYZ, and that XYZ was directly related to patient care. The economics, right? We just don't have the money. We're running in a negative amount. We can barely pay our employees. Our leadership doesn't have bonuses, whatever it may be. We're in really hard economic times, and you can truly demonstrate that. We just don't have the talent. We don't have access to the talent. We can't get the talent. We're in an extremely rural area, and we could deploy these tools, but ultimately, we're just not going to get the people that understand how to run these tools or do what we need them to do. Or there's no solution. And the fourth one is the hardest one to really justify, which is what we believe we need doesn't exist. That's a hard one. But the other three are typically ones that if you can really demonstrate these, then you can't make that investment, right? There's no way to do it. So this is ultimately just a reminder of how the roadmap works, right? We start with the risk tolerance at hopefully the board and C-suite level. That then is going to be what helps us figure out if our maturity model is at the right level of maturity, and if not, we're going to go ahead and build out a pretty straightforward, clear spreadsheet that hopefully addresses our gaps, our things to do, and then that's going to reinforce our risk tolerance. Let's see, I kind of just talked about all that. Just as a reminder, for those of you that may be attending, September 21, 23, we're going to be at the NRHA Critical Access Conference, so hopefully we get to meet some of you in person. We'd love to do that. Feel free to let us know. You can email us at info@sensado.co if you're going. We'd love to talk to you one-on-one if you have questions about this or any of the other things that we do. But with that, that's kind of everything I had for you today. I don't know if you have questions or thoughts or feedback. We don't believe we know it all, so there may be other approaches to this. My only suggestion would be always think about 18 months later and how you're going to deal with whatever decision you make in a deposition, because they're becoming much more commonplace now. So with that, not sure if there are questions or thoughts.
Thanks, John. I actually don't have any questions that have come through, so you have done a very thorough job, so thank you. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. As a reminder, I'm going to make sure that you get a link to the recording before the end of the day. Please feel free to share that with your team. Before I close this out, is there anything else you'd like to leave with everyone, John?
No, I know this sounds like a lot of work and maybe in some cases kind of scary, and maybe some of you are going, man, I wish I would have never attended this, but I would say take it one step at a time. We are always happy to do this presentation for boards and C-suite. We don't charge for that. So if you're like, hey, it'd be great if my board could hear this or my C-suite, we're happy to do that. But take it one step at a time, and ultimately it does provide you some dividends in terms of understanding your financial strategy and your maturity levels.
Great. Well, thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.